In the first half, we're fighting 4 waves of enemies, each wave consisting of 3 enemies. Waves 1 and 2 are Whopper Flowers, and waves 3 and 4 are Primal Constructs. Just based on the fact that we're fighting this many enemies, we can already tell that we need 2 key things for an efficient clear on this half: good grouping and consistent repeatable rotations. With the way that the timing works on this chamber, we're aiming to defeat each wave of enemies with just 1 rotation, with each rotation lasting a little over 20 seconds for most teams. This gives us a 80 to 90 second clear on this half, which should leave us with enough time to deal with the second half. This means that we have to be really good about keeping the enemies together and dealing AoE damage to all of them at the same time. The team that I'm using here is a pretty standard 4-star Hyper Bloom team. Hyper Bloom of course has great damage output, and since we're against the Primal Constructs, having Electro and Dendro in our party can come in handy to break their invisibility. Ideally, we should actually be defeating the Constructs before they can even enter their invisibility phase, but it is still nice to have those quicken reactions available just in case we slip up on one of the waves. With Xingqiu, Dendro Traveler, and Kuki acting as my Hyper Bloom core, I support the team with Sucrose as my flex pick, who is of course a great grouping utility. Now that we understand the motivation behind the team comp, let's go over some positional tips for this half. When the stage starts, I like to dash backwards towards the front of the arena, about 2 dashes worth of distance. This triggers the Whopper Flowers to teleport in front of me and creates a very good position to group them easily. With the second wave, we follow the same philosophy. I want to keep the fight close to the front of the arena. But if I see any of the Whopper Flowers put up their shield and start channeling, I prioritize breaking those shields over anything else because they will not be CCable if you allow that channel to complete. For the third and fourth waves, the Primal Constructs also spawn somewhat spread apart, which can make grouping them a little bit difficult. The trick to grouping these guys is to recognize that these are actually 3 different types of constructs. The one on the very left uses mostly ranged attacks, while the ones in the center and to the right use mostly melee attacks. This means that if we run to the far left side of the arena while lining ourselves up with the 3 constructs, the 2 melee ones will actually start to walk towards you and creates this position where all 3 constructs are grouped together. So as I go into the third and fourth waves, I don't start my rotation immediately. Instead, I run to the left side of the arena, and I wait to confirm that the center and rightmost constructs are moving towards that left construct. And lastly, as I execute my rotation, I'm constantly adjusting my position to try to focus the enemy that has the most HP remaining. And this is again consistent with our theme of trying to defeat all 3 enemies at roughly the same time. Of course, you don't have to use a 4-star team comp here. One very straightforward upgrade you can make is to replace Dendro Traveler with Nahida. Nahida has faster Dendro application, generally deals more damage, and can deal Dendro very consistently without depending on her burst, unlike the Dendro Traveler. All of these things make a Nahida Hyper Bloom team much more consistent and forgiving to execute, which makes it that much easier to clear this half in time. Another team that worked really well for me here is a Freeze team supported by Venti. All enemies on this half are freezable, and Venti in general is just an extremely strong pick on this half. So when you put those 2 together, it makes for an extremely easy clear. Unfortunately, this team isn't as F2P friendly, but I just wanted to highlight how effective it is for those who can make this team. In the second half, we're fighting 2 waves of enemies, and both waves have both Cryo and Hydro shields. Cryo shields are weak to Pyro, and Hydro shields are weak to Dendro, with Cryo being a solid runner-up. So with this information, we know we're probably going to want some kind of national core with Bennett and Xiangling for that fast Pyro application, supported by some Dendro or Cryo damage to deal with the Hydro shields. If we go for Dendro, then that gives us a burning team, which isn't really the strongest reaction, but if we add Hydro into the mix, we can turn it into a Burgeon team, which is a lot better. The main downside to this though is that Hydro isn't effective against either of the shields here, so we're kind of wasting a slot in our party just to enable those Burgeon reactions. If we go for Cryo, then that gives us a reverse melt team, which is a very strong option and the one that I decided to go with for this clear. For the 4th slot, you can use an Animo character or a second Cryo damage dealer such as Kaeya, but I chose to sprinkle in some Electro in the form of Beidou. While Electro isn't the most effective element for any of these shields, it does a decent job at damaging both. More importantly, Beidou improves my survivability thanks to the counter mechanism on her skill and the small shield from her burst. If you're watching this video, you probably already know this, but this fight becomes very chaotic and violent in the second wave, and survivability is just as much of an issue as damage output. With Beidou and the damage mitigation that she brings to the table, I found it slightly easier to clear this half, and I didn't have to retry as much compared to when I was using double Cryo. Now that we have our team comp, let's talk about combat and positional tips again. Similar to the first half, since we're fighting 3 heralds at once in the second wave, we ideally want to group all 3 of them together and take them down at the same time with AoE damage. Unfortunately, this isn't very easy to do consistently because all 3 enemies tend to move around a lot, and once they enter their shield phase, you can't knock them back to manipulate their position either. The general approach I try to follow is to focus the Hydro Herald from an angle that allows me to see both the Cryo Heralds. Throughout the fight, I try my best to keep all 3 heralds inside Bennett and Rosario's AoEs, using Beidou's skill and burst to stagger them in the appropriate directions. Even so, this doesn't work all the time because the Hydro Herald can always use the spinning dash attack, and when that happens I usually ignore him for the time being and just focus on keeping the 2 Cryo Heralds grouped together. As I mentioned earlier, these heralds have a lot of multi-hit staggering attacks and also deal a lot of damage in general, so it's really important first of all to fight from an angle where you can see all of them in one view, so you know which attacks are coming. But also you have to be very judicious about when you use your bursts. Always be looking out for the stronger attacks with the long windups, and if your burst is available, consider holding it a little bit longer to iframe those attacks, instead of always using your burst immediately off the cooldown. The easiest example to apply this is when they transform into their shield phase. They all perform a strong AoE attack. So whenever I see that one of them is about to transform, I hold my bursts and use it to avoid that damage if possible. Finally, as a general tip, don't stay on one character for too long. The key to breaking these shields efficiently is to use all of your different abilities as frequently as possible, so make sure you're rotating through your characters and skills consistently throughout the fight. The other reason this is important is because of energy. Energy usually becomes a limiting factor after you enter the shield phase because you can't trigger Favonius and sack weapon effects against shields, and a lot of characters depend on these effects for their energy requirements. Because of this, you have to be really diligent about getting your energy from just the skill particles, and that makes it much more important to cycle through those skills often. Now let's go back to discussing a few more team comp options on this half. One very effective 5-star improvement you can make is to add Kazuha into this team. Kazuha is really good at breaking multiple shields at once because of his large AoE animo attacks, and the fact that his burst can absorb other elements, effectively giving you another source of pyro or cryo on top of the animo damage he already deals. But aside from his shield breaking utility, Kazuha is actually deceptively durable. His skill allows him to jump up and out of the way of a lot of attacks, and it's also really good at staggering enemies so they can't attack him in the first place. When you combine this with its relatively short cooldown, you can swap to Kazuha up to 3 or 4 times in a single rotation and he'll barely take any damage. On top of this, since he is a 5-star character, his burst animation is slightly longer, which makes it really easy to iframe a lot of attacks with it. So if I could only take one 5-star into the second half, my pick would definitely be Kazuha. We can go one step further and add Raiden into the mix and turn this into a full-fledged Hyper Raiden / Overloaded team. Even though we don't have Cryo or Dendro in this case, like I mentioned before, Electro is still decent at breaking both types of shields, and with the amount of AoE damage that we have, even though we don't have the hard counter to the Hydro Shield, we can still break it extremely quickly. One other character that helps a lot here is Zhongli. As usual, he makes survivability a non-issue, so you just have to focus on dealing damage and breaking the shields as quickly as possible. The fact that you don't have to worry about dying improves your consistency a lot on this half. Those are all the tips I have for this chamber. The builds for the characters I used in this video will follow right after this, and as usual, thank you so much for watching.